one of the questions I want us to end with this week and to ponder is this idea is natural selection is the process that results in adaptive evolution. But can evolution be a natural selection? Can it create or fashion a perfect organism? Meaning an organism that can survive in all environments, can use a wide variety of resources, that can reproduce no matter what. Is there such a thing as a perfect organism that natural selection, that this process can fashion, can create? It's kind of an odd question, because really, if natural selection could, would we have so many species on our planet? If there was such a thing as fashioning a perfect organism, wouldn't our entire planet just be populated by that organism? Whatever that might be? Forever? Right? But really, natural selection can't fashion a perfect organism. And let's talk about why. Adaptations always have limits. So some of those limits are genetic constraints, meaning that new genes or new traits for natural selection to act on can't just be invented, okay? They come about through the process of gene mutations, gene replications or duplications rather. So there's the genetic portion of adaptations. We can't just create new genes in a species to deal with a new environment or a new selective pressure, right? Especially, let's think about, like we talked about before, a bottleneck event. If a population drops significantly, we're going to lose a lot of genetic diversity with all of these organisms that we lost, right? If our population was here at first and then after the bottleneck event it was here, that's a lot of genetic diversity that we've lost. Over time, some of that genetic diversity might be recovered as the population starts to recover. More individuals we have, more mutations might arise, so on and so forth. We might start to see some new traits arise, but that's a slow process, okay? And so even though these individuals might be great if they could invent a new way of eating so that way they can utilize a new food resource, or if they could start to fly, right? That'd be awesome. Natural selection doesn't work that way. Mutations don't work that way. Natural selection is a tinkering, right? It takes what's there, the genetics of what's there, and new traits arise, new mutations arise, and natural selection kind of acts on those traits. It kind of tinkers with what's already present. Okay, so we can't invent new genes or new traits that allow organisms to exploit or utilize new resources or survive in different environments. And kind of along the same line of there's limits to adaptations, is that there's always a trade-off to an adaptation. So if we increase the fitness of one trait, if we increase the amount of investment that we put into one trait that lets us, say, exploit a food resource, that's going to come at the detriment of another trait. Maybe the more energy we put into exploiting this food resource, the less energy we have potentially for reproduction. So here's an example that I absolutely love. So here we have the rough-skinned newt and the common garter snake. Okay, rough-skinned newts are poisonous. So they produce a poison called TTX. We'll just call it TTX. That's all we need to know. In areas where these two species overlap, where their populations overlap, garter snakes have developed a resistance to this poison. Okay, this is not insignificant. These newts can produce enough poison per newt to kill about 7 people. That's a lot, right? So with increase of TTX production, this poison in the newts, they're more likely to survive and therefore more likely to reproduce, right? But creating that poison takes energy, okay? So they're more likely to survive, but now they have less energy available to dedicate towards reproduction. So it's a trade-off. We're going to trade off surviving longer, potentially, but we're not going to produce as many offspring, okay? Versus if we were to produce less of this poison, we'd be more likely to be eaten, but we could potentially make more offspring, right? So it's this trade-off, this balance, right? And then on the snake side, on the garter snake side, again, garter snakes, if you see one, they're totally fine. Don't worry about them. They're not venomous at all. They're not going to harm you. But garter snakes, so those that have the ability to consume newts that have TTX, they have a new food resource they can use, a different food resource they can use, okay? So they're able to eat these newts. And newts, have you ever seen a newt crawling, like walking? They're very slow usually, right? So like it's not gonna be that hard to catch one of these guys. So it's a pretty easily exploitable food resource for the snakes that can produce that toxin. But they did this study, I would have loved to have been there when they did the study. They did a study that the garter snakes that had more resistance to this poison that the newts make were slower. They couldn't move as fast. So they're trading off energy being put into TTX resistance, being resistance to this poison. They're trading off that resistance for movement, for speed, for energy that's dedicated towards movement, which means they can't move as fast. They're not going to be able to get as many other different types of food, right? But let's say they don't put in that energy into TTX resistance. They can't use this food resource, but they could move faster. They have a higher crawling speed, right? So they could potentially utilize other food resources besides the newts if they aren't TTX resistant. Okay, so it's always a trade-off. We're always, if we invest energy into one adaptation, we're taking energy away from another adaptation. And then this last piece for why natural selection can't fashion a perfect organism is because the environment is always changing. There's always something changing about the environment, whether it's new species moving in, other species going extinct, climate change is a huge one, plate tectonics moving, right? So a trait that's adaptive in this environment today, right now, may not be adaptive in the future, okay? So, for example, a very sad example because it's caused by us humans, polar bears are highly adapted to living in the Arctic and using floating pieces of ice to hunt for seals and things like that in the water, right? But the environment is changing. So these adaptations that they have that allow them to exploit this resource in this specific environment may not necessarily be helpful moving into the future. Okay, so the environment is always changing. So natural selection can't predict what's going to happen. Natural selection is acting in the here and now. Okay, it's only choosing which individuals are most reproductively fit or most have the highest fitness for this current environment. Okay. So again, natural selection can't think forward. There's always some sort of trade-off when we're talking about adaptations. And there's genetic constraints. We can't invent new traits to allow a species or an individual to survive.